Do-do-do. Hello, everybody. Happy Friday. Welcome back. We're here in the expert space on Angular Nation. We have summoned some big experts today, and it's very exciting. We started with Craig, aka Fuzzy Bunny, who had a storybook question. We summoned our resident storybook expert, Kai Roeder, and then we kind of talked through the problem. It turns out it's kind of a more complicated problem, so we went for reinforcements, y'all. We got Mark Berry from the Storybook team, who's the Angular guy on the Storybook team, and we got Alex Rickabaugh from the Angular team. So this is going to be so much fun. I'm excited. So we're going to kick it off first with just some quick introductions, and then Craig is going to tell us why he brought us all here. And it sounds like, Craig, you got it fixed, but it's still such a good discussion because I don't think you're the only one who's had this problem. So it's going to be fun. Okay. Craig, you want to introduce yourself real quick? We'll go through the introductions and then we'll come back to you to hear the pain.
Sure. Okay, my name's Craig Charenson. I work at a company. We do financial software. We have an Angular front end, maybe 10 applications and 15 libraries. So I manage the architecture team. We use Storybook for everything. Sometimes it's little components, sometimes it's big applications, the whole thing. So because it's been so useful, we're big fans over at my company. And so thank you very much for coming to join this call and talk through it.
We're big fans of Storybook here at Angular Nation too. We just love it. Okay, Kai Roeder, our in-house Storybook guru. How are you doing, Kai? Thanks for coming back.
I'm fine. Let me introduce myself as well. As you said, I'm Kai, and I'm an external maintainer for Storybook. Not so much contributing to the code base, but trying to convince people to use Storybook, actually, as much as possible. And also, of course, a Storybook user at my company and maintaining our own Storybook. So this goes hand in hand.
And Kai has a cute little baby. He's not a little baby anymore at home and lots of work to do. So Kai's busy, but there's a very good chance that if you come in and start asking questions about Storybook, if we cannot help you, we can summon Kai over in the Storybook channel and he will appear. So speaking of summoning, we asked you to run and get Mark Berry, who we know Mark Berry. We love Mark Berry, but we haven't seen Mark in a while. And so we have Mark. How are you doing, Mark? Thank you so much for making time for us today.
Yeah, doing good.
We had to bring in the big guns today, my friend. Do you want to introduce yourself? You want to say anything?
Yeah, I guess I'm sort of like Kai as far as contributing. It's like I don't, I guess, contribute the most, but I try to keep up with what Storybook's doing. And if you ask questions in like Storybook's Discord, and if it's about Angular, I'm most likely going to be the one that answers it. So I try to kind of keep up with it, and I do a lot of helping people get stuff fixed in their Discord. So.
That's awesome. And we love it. Like I said, I love just having everybody turn their cameras on and have these conversations face to face, because for me, it's so much fun to nerd out over this stuff. So we love it when you have time to stop by. So thank you for coming. It's good to have you. And last but not least, rounding out our swarm today, we got Alex Rickabaugh from the Angular team. How are you doing, Alex?
I am doing fantastic. Thanks for having me.
We love having you here. It's always a fun day when you're here. And I think, I don't know if I speak for all of us, but I believe in my heart that you could pretty much solve any problem. So I feel like all of us are unstoppable when you're here with us. So this is so exciting. Okay.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, so am I. Okay, so this has been really fun because we have a problem. We don't know really what the solution is. So we go get an expert, we go get another expert, and then we're all coming in to just have this conversation and talk through it. And it's just going to be such a fun conversation, especially if you're a fan of Storybook and Angular. You're not going to want to miss this. Okay, so back to Craig. Craig, also known as Fuzzy Bunny. I love that. Can you just give us a quick synopsis of how this whole adventure started? It was 6 to 7, right? Storybook version 6 to 7.
Yeah, I guess more specifically, it was Angular 14 to 16, which required that we go from 6 to 7, which I was more than happy to do. what I found was that the migration of Angular from 14 to 16 was the easy part. Migrating from Storybook 6 to 7 was by far the biggest overhead. I ran the migration scripts, I followed the documentation, and after that, there were a lot of breaking changes still that I needed to go and correct. And to be fair, I found all the answers in the documentation. I mean, it was there, but you really had to read every line of that documentation to understand it. So I put a bullet list together on the Storybook Angular Nation channel where I just kind of summarized all the things that I encountered. Was this normal? Did anybody else experience this, etc.? And in the end, I was successful. I'm moving ahead now. We're on Angular 16 across the company. We are on Storybook 7. I'm very much looking forward to leveraging all the new features that I can now use. And I've started already. There was a Figma import thing where I could see the design right next to my stories, which is, I think that's going to be useful. So I've implemented that last week. Anyway, that said, there were some, I think, kind of uncomfortable workarounds that I needed to deploy to get it working. I'm not fully convinced I've done this right, having to do with the mostly the new module metadata, app config, and provide animations and provide import providers from HTTP module config, etc. Things like that. So and standalone, which Alex, we had a talk last week. I'm very eager to start making everything across the entire application standalone components, but I couldn't get that to work in Storybook. So that's the summary. Over to you.
That's a very good summary. And I think it's a great opportunity, even if maybe not today. I don't want to get anybody's hopes up today, but it's a great opportunity, especially to bring everybody together and kind of identify the problem, because it sounds like you left a couple of opportunities that you might, if you're lucky, be able to get some help from the Storybook team, the Angular team, to go back and smooth it over and clean it up a bit.
It's interesting. Okay. Can I start right away? So
absolutely.
Interesting that you say you have problems with standalone. I'm about to upgrade. I did it once in a test run from 6 to 7 just to figure out how much work it will be in our company. But we postponed this, and I'm on 15 and Storybook 6 and use standalone quite a lot. But it's a library. Maybe it's the difference in how you use your components in your application, but encountered no issues at all. So what's the actual error?
Oh my, the actual error from using standalone components. I think that I ran into problems with making sure that providers provided services. And so I think as a workaround, I just created an external module, put all of my declarations and services in there, and imported that module into my story. And that got it to work. And I was thinking, this is pretty clunky. I would rather just declare everything here in my story. That would be cleaner, but I got it to work.
So providing the services was what was difficult.
I think
I would like to throw something in here, because I would actually like to get Alex's feedback on this. When it comes to providing services and lazy loading things, because we're lazy loading a lot of things, which is good. Obviously, we want to lazy load things. That's a good thing. When it comes to lazy loading services, I've had a lot of questions about this, and provided in root, or are we providing them in the lazy loaded module? And somewhere along the way, someone asked me, well, if you're lazy loading, it can get complicated, where you're providing your services and injecting them in the right place. But if you provide them at root and that works, the question becomes, how big are your services? Because if we actually look at the services and it's 5 kilobytes, or it's like a tiny little bit of code, it's not that much code, then it becomes like this. You might be overthinking this, because I've worked in some really big enterprise companies. And when we do ask that question, because I started asking that question myself, is this really something that we need to spend a lot of time on? Because if it's working and the services aren't big, then we could just keep moving and focus on something else that's more costly. And so when I asked that question, when I was doing enterprise, I never really did find anyone who said, oh, our services are really big. So Alex, what would you, is that good advice? Is that bad advice? Do we need to care about that?
Oh, I love this discussion. This is so interesting. This came up in the context of like our reactivity in computeds as well. Like, hey, if you're using computeds for your computations and those computations aren't that expensive, like, should you be worrying about that? Or, you know, is it too much overhead and not enough benefit or something like that?
Right.
And the way I think about it is this. You can, if you are a dedicated developer, you can look at these things. You can look at your service and see like what it depends on, how much code is it, what's that translate to in bytes, will it compress well, all these kinds of things. And
because you can lazy load it.
Yeah. And you can make a very opinionated decision in this particular circumstance. Like, I'm going to provide this service here, right? I'm going to put it on the route, or I will like do the work to dynamically import it because I know that it's going to be of some benefit. Or I can look at it and see it's, you know, it's 5 lines of code, right? It's left pad the service, and I can just, it doesn't matter where I load that. Doing that has a cost. And in particular, one person who's very dedicated can get this right all the time. And Jeremy has a saying that 1,000 developers working on something will like always get it wrong. So if you're trying to kind of manually optimize things, that doesn't scale. And it's taking your attention away from actually shipping features. So the approach that I'd like is the hands-off approach of let the tooling deal with it. Set things up in such a way that anything can be lazy loaded, which is provided in root, and let the bundler decide basically what's worth doing or not. And the tooling is going to get it right better than, you know, a team of 1,000 developers, almost guaranteed. The same is true, I think, for like reactivity and computeds. Like, yes, there might be overhead to putting things in a computed that don't need to be, but doing that means that you don't have to think about it and you won't get it wrong when it does matter.
I love that. It's very simple. And this is one of the reasons why I really enjoy having the Angular team stop by, because, and Storybook team too, because when you hear how it was intended to be, and if you can figure out how to do it properly, then it's so simple.
Yeah.
And you guys just make our jobs easier and easier with every version.
It doesn't help in this situation that I think provided in root is a very confusing name. Because it kind of implies that like you're throwing this thing into the root of the application and making the root bigger and bigger and bigger.
Right.
Which
when it comes to components, if you're importing a whole bunch of different things into your root, that's really not what you want. But when it comes to services.
Yeah. The interesting thing is for services, provided in root does the exact opposite. It's saying this thing can, it's actually putting the provider for the component for the service on the service itself. And you're saying that like when this service is loaded, it should be loaded into the root injector. But because there is no provider in the root injector itself, the service is free to be loaded wherever it's needed. The optimizer is free to choose to like lazy load that service along with your component if it can.
Love it.
So having the provided in root actually kind of decouples the service from the root injector so that it doesn't need to be loaded with the root injector in order to be created.
And we don't want to overcorrect and start loading everything in the root, because that's not what we want. We don't want to put our shared components or anything like that in the root.
Yeah, components are different, right? Like the component providers or component imports, that's a very different world.
Well, I think that might be why people are like really trying to keep the root very clean, because they've learned like don't put everything in the root. But when we specifically talk about services, then we do want to provide it in the root. And it's also so simple and easy.
the advice I give people is like, make it provided in root unless you have a specific reason not to.
Yeah.
And there are valid reasons not to. Maybe you want to scope something to a particular route, or, you know, you want like state for every instance of a component for that service. So you would provide it in the component instead. But when in doubt, provided in root is not going to, you're not going to get it wrong.
So it sounds like if we go back to the Storybook issue, what Kai is saying is that he's using Standalone and not necessarily having these problems. Is that right? But also, Kai, you're on version 6 and you haven't gone to version 7 yet. So maybe these problems are in your future, and it's a good thing that Craig is like hacking through a path.
I have a different assumption and actually a follow-up question for you, Craig. So I said I'm using Standalone from a library perspective. So I usually don't have services provided in root, but mostly local state for like UI components and stuff like that to hold my state. So the component itself provides the service. And the follow-up question is like, is your issue with Standalone and root provided services or local provided services?
Oh, I try to do root provided everywhere, like Alex explained.
I mean, based on what I had read in like I guess the original post, or yeah, he had Craig had put on there like that list. It sounds like it's more about how I mean, I could be wrong, but I think it's more about how the module metadata decorator that Storybook uses was changed a little bit to where now a new concept was added to where we have this application config decorator. And the reason that was added, which Alex probably could explain what the differences actually are necessary for, but the way Storybook used to work is it would go through each of those module metadata decorators. So call each one, merge all those objects, I guess, together, and then create an ng module out of it, and also create a root component that it uses as your kind of story application. It would bootstrap that component, and that component was like in this ng module, so it was bootstrapping that ng module and rendering that component. Well, it changed now to where that root component is a standalone component. So it's using the bootstrap component, and then that ng module that was created is now one of the imports in that standalone component. And so now if you have like a from root in one of your imports, it throws an error. So we added the application config so that it can be added to that second parameter for the environment providers are on the bootstrap component. So now if there's an easier way to handle whether that actually needs to be separated, I'm not sure. I'm still kind of new to the standalone components, but that's kind of why that new application config decorator was added, because the root component is now a standalone component and that's bootstrapped instead of an ng module.
We're all new to Standalone.
Okay.
Yeah, so I can take a stab at kind of talking about how I see it, at least. So if you've worked with React, right, you know that a common operation in React has the like render component operation. Basically, like I have a component and I have a DOM node and I want these two to get married, right? And I want to render my component into the DOM node. And bootstrapping Angular looks a little bit different, because in React, the component is kind of the component is the primary piece, right? It's the top level thing. A React application is a component that renders children components. In Angular, there's something that's above the component itself. So you have your root component, which is your application component, but above that is what we call the application. And the application is kind of the environment that exists around the component. So all of the services that the are shared, the root services. It's the ng zone that's going to like intercept all the change detection that all of the components are doing. And so in Angular, you have to deal with these two concepts. You need the environment, you need the application, and then once you create that, you can render one or more components inside of it. And what happened with ng modules was that these two concepts were mixed together. So you would write an application module, and the application module would describe both kind of how you want to set up the environment, the application, all of the services I want to load. You import browser module, which gets you zones and everything else. And you would kind of declare like, this is my app component, and my app component has these things available in its template. So with Standalone, we separated these two concepts. So now you have the application that's configured, and you have a component to bootstrap for that application, and that component configures its own template dependencies. And so that's what Mark is talking about. The nature of this change was to kind of separate or extend that separation to Storybook. So now you have a place where you define your application configuration, and you have a standalone component that you're loading. And this is the reason why directives and pipes also have a standalone flag, right? Even though they don't have templates, they're not importing any dependencies. But them saying standalone is kind of them promising that, hey, I'm not trying to configure the application too, right? I'm not expecting to bring providers in some module that's going to get loaded into the environment, into the application injector. I'm just a directive.
Okay, wrapping my head around that.
And that is one of the kind of the trickier things about migrating an application to standalone. So the excellent schematic that Christian wrote, right? That schematic is really good at doing the mechanical part of taking your template and understanding what's used in the template and converting that from ng module to standalone. But the trickier part, and the part that's harder to do, is tracing the dependency injection dependencies. Looking for these cases where a component or a directive is relying on a service being provided that might not be anymore if it's used as a standalone thing without importing the module that it used to be part of. So,
Alex, I have learned that sometimes when you've been working on this stuff for a long time, it kind of comes easily because you've been looking at it for so long.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can back up and explain it like we're 5.
Sure. I think examples are probably the best way to do that.
We love examples.
Let's do an example. Okay, if I present.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Okay. I will share the link in the chat in case anyone wants to jump in and type with me. But so let's say I was writing Angular before Standalone, and I have a component, and it's just going to be a counter component. Because we love counter examples, right? And this is going to like increase some count that we have. So selector, counter component, and we'll have our template here, which will have like a counter display because we're architects and we make things more complicated than it needs to be. So we're just going to separate the display part of the count from the increment part of the count. And then we'll have a button that we click. This is probably not super necessary, but just for the sake of complete example, right? Here. Count is 0. Okay. So previously we have the counter component and the counter display component, which I'm not going to write in this example, in an ng module together. We'll call it the counter module. And let's say we want to do a refactoring here and move the storage of this count out into a shared service. So all the counter components have the same count that they're incrementing. We can do that by creating a service. So we'll have an injectable class count service, which has the count. And we'll set up a providers for it, right? Count service. And then here, we can inject the count service and increment the count there and count service, right? So we have the same setup, but now our counter component does not work without this count service, right? It expects that count service to be available to it whenever it's created. And the users who were previously depending on the counter component didn't have to care at all about this change because the ng module is now doing two things here. Let's actually just make sure we have like counter component exported here, right? So if you import this ng module, you in your templates get to use counter component. So counter component is made available to consumers, right? So somewhere else in the application, I can have my like class app module, and I can say here, oh, I'm going to import the counter module. And then any of the application components that are declared in this ng module can use the counter component because it's made available to them. But importing this ng module does something else, right? It brings these providers into the application. So count service is guaranteed to be provided anywhere counter component can be used. This is really the key thing. The ng module has married making the components available, making it so that someone can depend on counter component. The only way to get counter component is to load the ng module, and loading the ng module has a side effect of providing the service in whatever context it was loaded into. So the ng module is doing two things. It's giving you access to the counter component, and it's making sure the counter component has all of the dependencies that it needs. Because if you loaded the ng module, then you loaded the dependencies as well. So fast forward, we're upgrading to Angular 14. We decide, hey, this counter component thing can really become standalone. So I guess I'll stop. And is everyone with me here? Understand the example?
I understand.
Questions?
One quick question. I still have some modules where I use the for root pattern.
Mm-hmm.
Should I stop doing that? You know, the dot for root, and then you can pass some config. Is that old school, and I need to eradicate that? Because that actually caused me some issues. Because then you have to use that import providers from. You can no longer import that.
Yep.
Into
So for root is just a convention, right? It's a function that provides both an ng module and some extra providers on top.
Yeah.
And typically when you're doing standalone, what used to be a for root just becomes a function that exports some providers, some environment providers. So the ng module piece of it goes away, and you're left with just like, you know, some providers that need to be loaded into the root of the application. So that's why in Angular, you'll see like router module.forRoot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Used to be the ng module way of doing things. Now there's just provide router. And these two are essentially the same thing.
Okay.
This used to return a bunch of providers, right?
Yeah.
Plus the router module. And if you're doing standalone, you're not using the router module anymore. So this just returns the providers that used to be part of the for root.
And then you can pass your array of routes through to the provide router, just like.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. Good. I need to clear this for root stuff out of my system first, because it's just causing me unnecessary difficulty.
So I think actually, I'm just looking this up at the moment. Okay, yeah. Cool. So, any other questions before I go on in this example?
Yeah. So today I actually had an issue with I wanted to create a pipe, and this pipe needs another provider.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought I'm gonna use the with ng modules, because I should not use standalone for the pipe when it actually needs another provider, right?
Yes, correct. So if the pipe isn't actually standalone, right, it needs some other dependencies to be brought in with it, then you have a few options. One is to say the service, if it's possible to provide the service the pipe needs as provided in root, then the user doesn't have to think about it, right? That service will just be available anywhere the pipe is used. That's kind of the way I would recommend trying to structure it. But if the user does need to think about how that service is made available or where it's provided, then you can either document it as a dependency of the pipe, or use something like ng modules that actually ties the provider of the service together with the pipe.
Okay, so the pipe actually doesn't need a service, but an injection token, just a static value, because we use that for it was actually a pipe which like appends the deploy URL to an URL you give for example, image source.
Yeah.
And so it needs that deploy URL token. And
so I think it's fine to make that standalone, because the injection token is really part of the configuration interface for the pipe, right? You're saying like, to use this pipe, users will have to provide this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very normal for pipes and components to have dependencies, to have configuration that needs to be available in order to use them. The image directive does this in Angular, right? It needs to know something about the CDN that you're using. And it doesn't stop the directive from being standalone. It just means that it'll yell at you if you don't configure it correctly.
Okay, so how would you recommend to structure that, or just to make it clear for everybody, just to have a good convention, how they should use the pipe and where they should inject the token?
Yeah. How about, can I finish this example and then we'll do the kind of pipe example?
Yeah, sure.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So to kind of recap, the key thing I was talking about here is the only way to use counter component is through the module, and loading the module ensures the service is provided somewhere, right? So that kind of makes it impossible for counter component to ever be created or used anywhere without the service being available. So now we say, okay, we want to make this thing actually standalone. So counter component becomes standalone. It has a dependency on this counter display. So we have an imports here, and we can get rid of our ng module. Hooray, right? I think the migration will actually just do this. So our ng module no longer has to deal with the component. It's possible for the application to start just importing the counter component directly. Maybe somewhere in the app component, if we also convert that to standalone, maybe in the app module. But we've made a semantic change here, because now we're depending on the counter component directly here, but the counter component needs a service in order to function. It needs this count service to be available, and we haven't accounted for that. Nothing is providing that service.
Mm-hmm.
So we could say, well, if you're using counter component, then you have to actually provide the count service yourself here. Maybe we have some fancy like utility function provide, count service, or provide like count config or something like that. If there's different kinds of options you can set up with this thing. And we just put in our documentation on the counter component in our library, like, hey, if you're using this thing, you have to make sure that it's configured properly. Or a different approach is to say, hey, this count service is provided in root. And that basically means that this count service provider is implicit. We don't need to explicitly provide this thing anywhere because just attempting to inject it is enough. This says, hey, it's safe for Angular to just create this thing when it's requested. Just assume that it's supposed to be loaded at the root level. And now we're back in the same situation where we can depend on the counter component directly, and that's enough because it doesn't require any extra application injector configuration. It can just be loaded and used directly.
Okay, I got it.
And we can kind of mirror this example to talk about the pipe, right? So I have some pipe that I want to make standalone. And let's say this pipe requires like, a token, right? Like URL token.
Yes.
So this pipe doesn't work without this token. There's a couple of options here. If this token is what I would call just like required configuration, then there's really not that much difference between asking users to specify it when they import the ng module and asking users to just provide it. So I would just kind of like write documentation for this thing saying, requires the application to configure the URL token. And then when I go to use this pipe in my app module, I say, oh, I'm going to like set up my URL to whatever my application is supposed to be. The other thing we can do is if we create this URL as an injection token, you can make injection tokens provided in root. And we have to give it a factory. So if there's some like default URL, right? Maybe it's just /, then we can set this thing up so that the user can override it anytime they choose. But it's not a requirement that they provide it if the value, if like there's a good default value for it. HTTP client kind of works this way. So if we dig into Angular's code, where is this thing declared? SRF, yeah. So Angular's HTTP client has cross-site request forgery prevention built in. And that's done with this like cookie to header pattern where you take the value in a cookie that comes from the server, you pass it into the request header. And these things are set up with 2 injection tokens for the cookie name and the header name. And you can see these injection tokens are configured exactly in that way. So there's a default value for the cookie name. There's a default value for the header name. And if the user doesn't provide these things, they can still be injected. They'll hit this root factory that's already set up, this root provider, and get the default names. Or the user can import these tokens and override them themselves.
Okay, thank you. That made it a lot clearer. Thanks. Sorry, I forgot to turn on my camera before. I have a short follow-up question. Do you think it would be good, or like what should be the best practice, or is there a best practice to provide this token? Like, should I write a function, maybe provide a deploy URL config or URL token config, something like that, so the users can use that?
Yes, that's kind of exactly what I would recommend. Largely because, especially if this is going into a library, you want the ability to evolve that interface over time, right? The set of things that your pipe needs might change. Maybe you have more configuration that can be beneficial for how this URL is generated. And so rather than having a bunch of tokens that they have to import and configure, you have one entry point that's like, yeah, provide, URL config or something like that. And the user can specify here like the base URL, right? Maybe like whether it's secure or not. And because you have this options object, you have the ability to kind of add new optional configuration over time. This is also a good place to kind of encode the default values for these things.
So this would like this function would replace the for root function.
Yes, exactly. And it returns this environment provider thing, which is just a special provider type that's harder to misuse because you can't accidentally throw it in a component.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. The for root thing is really nearly a direct translation to provider functions most of the time, because they're doing the same thing. It's just a bucket of providers that you want to include in the application level.
So you said at the application level, could I also use it on the component level, or would that then be like wrong or not the wrong convention?
That generally is the wrong thing to do. You can have, there's nothing stopping you from creating provider functions that work at the component level. But the for root pattern specifically, right? This is a convention that says, I want this configuration to live in the whole application.
Mm-hmm.
No, it doesn't, for something like the router, right? It doesn't really make sense to provide the router on a component level. Because what does it mean to have 4 different routers on the page that are all trying to like change the URL? So if you're directly translating something that used to be for root, I'd recommend like returning the environment providers, because it has the same safety guarantee of you can't just stick it in a component and try to import your thing into a random components providers.
Okay, thanks.
I love these conversations. Okay, while Alex has this amazing code up, because I think it's so fun when Alex starts live coding and explaining stuff, because I don't think anybody teaches Angular better than the Angular team. I want to mention to Mark, I don't know if you're watching the chat, but Craig had some more questions about Storybook, so I want to circle back to that. So I just want you to be aware. But in the meantime, while we're here, does anybody else have questions while Alex has this code up? No? Okay. Craig, do you want to jump in? And I think, and it sounds like some of this problem that you were having, Craig, might have actually been just like kind of the pain of moving from standalone to, or from ng modules to standalone, and then knowing where to put everything. And it sounds like if Storybook is like on the standalone bandwagon, then it might help you to clean things up. Is this conversation helpful? Is this like
very
knowing?
Yeah, it's very helpful. I understand. So context, we started with Angular 2 and we upgraded to 4 and then 6 and then 8. We've been just kind of keeping up. So our code base, while we try to keep on the most recent cutting edge as best we can, there will be some code that probably maybe we haven't put the provided in root. I have to go back and check. And what I'm starting to understand, and just a little bit of comments that Michel put on as well. He's suggesting that until you've done like until you've migrated to the current way, which is, standalone components, your services should be injected. They should all be provided in root. Then your stories can handle that fine. Get rid of all of the for root pattern, etc. And so I'm sort of mid-journey. And for whatever reason, I think Storybook doesn't like that, or that's what I'm gathering. But I see that I still have work to do on my side too. It shouldn't just, accept everything anybody throws at it. So
what it sounds to me right now is you have an application that's like working, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And you have some components that are standalone, and they're working because they're inside of an application that has all of the services that they need to function. And then when you try to make a Storybook story with that component, you're kind of taking it out of your functioning application and trying to bootstrap it in an environment that doesn't have all of its configuration present.
Yeah,
can we still blame it on Storybook though?
No blame. I was not able to move to standalone components. I don't think there's any standalone components. Now, when that was first introduced as a concept, I was eager and I went and I started making those changes until I found out that it didn't work in Storybook. And then
so when you try to make a component standalone, then you hit this problem of the Storybook story doesn't have all of everything that component needs to function. Yeah,
and I think that like the non-standalone components still work pretty much the same in Storybook unless the provider returns that environment providers, then it errors. And because
we saw similar things, right? So we have a huge application and we kind of did a part standalone conversion. All our smart components, all our basically screen components, we all converted to standalone. Also, our shared library that contains all the directives and pipes, we made that standalone because that was easy picking. But we waited with our UI components library, which was the largest one, because that was still a bit messy. It had a bit too many, they were not dumb enough, basically. So it took a bit longer. And in that in-between time, when we went from Storybook 6 to 7, we had loads of challenges, which involved all the ideas of, okay, so we have this component that we want to test, but it's standalone, but it still has module dependencies of the UI components. So where do we put which providers? Because we found out, okay, we have a new application config thing, and I fairly much really quickly, when all the Storybook stories started falling apart after that, I realized, oh wait, the Storybook wrapper component is now actually standalone. So the way I switched this in my mind is, okay, so the Storybook wrapper is standalone, which means it's basically the Bootstrap application component in my head, right? I'm not sure if that was the right one, but then I started to realize, okay, so all the stuff that would go in there will have to go into the application config providers. And that made sense, and that solved a lot of stuff. We just had way too much stuff now in our Storybook stories, because we had the standalone stuff, but we also needed to import loads of other module stuff. So we had all kinds of mixed imports of standalone with modules, internal modules, external modules, material modules, because it was a mess. So our Storybook, so we kind of said, okay, we're just going to switch it off for a while. Well, not primarily, but we're also using Cypress to test against Storybook for certain cases. So stuff was failing a bit in our pipelines and stuff. So then we spent
go
time.
get the Cypress team if we need to.
No, Cypress is Cypress fine. But
I will summon more people.
I love the Cypress team.
I mean,
we
Cypress,
can make that happen.
Cypress is great. I mean, there's other political stuff going on within Cypress, which is worrying to us, but that's another story. Okay, so then we decided, okay, let's just spend an entire sprint to actually convert all stuff to standalone, which worked. So everything is now standalone except for app module. Okay, I still need to do that one, right? But now we could clean up Storybook like ridiculous. I mean, we could strip out everything almost. We just looked at the Storybook template and said, okay, this is the stuff that's used, right? You just go back to the conversion to standalone mindset. Basically, you look at the HTML and see which has the red squiggly lines. And you say, okay, my component needs that thing. Okay, then import at component level. And so the same thing you could do in Storybook. So it actually works really well now. It made it a lot simpler once you have everything converted to standalone. I mean, it's really explicit. I mean, I'm a big fan of standalone. I don't know if you can tell, but yeah, I love it. It's really nice. So that's what we saw in Storybook. So the halfway station actually made things really confusing, and also caused all kinds of R3 injector provider errors and stuff, and which are really hard to debug still. So for example, what we still have is, in certain stories, we still have the need to still do a provide animations and still do an import providers from Met dialog because of reasons. We're still not entirely sure. But if we remove that, then the Storybook wrapper just crashes really hard, right? So I'm sure once we also fix our app module and go standalone there, just do a proper Bootstrap application, that we'll have that under control. So we've got that all fixed. And it's actually better now. It's cleaner now. So I think it was a good move, Storybook-wise. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the one of the really useful tools here in starting to unravel some of these things, because I've seen similar things in applications in Google that have tried to use standalone, where they kind of ng modules make it really easy to not realize how much stuff is getting pulled into an application configuration. And when you start seeing it listed out all explicitly, one, it can be a little overwhelming, and like now you have to manage this big chunk of dependencies, but also you can start realizing things like, oh, this shouldn't need that. Why is it depending on that, right? And the new dependency injection visualization in DevTools is a great way to start pulling at some of those threads. Like, where is this coming from, right? Why is this service being injected here? The other thing you mentioned is like the import providers from Mat dialog. Material, as probably everyone knows, is not yet using standalone. And that's mostly because of bandwidth. They've been entirely focused on the Material 3 kind of design token side of things. So that is on the roadmap for a future Material release.
We can make stuff so much more simpler if Material is standalone as well, especially when all the directives are standalone as well, because I love host directives, but I can't use them really yet because I've got Material stuff that I need to. I can't wait for that one. That one should be good.
Exactly.
Nice.
So it sounds like Storybook, the Storybook upgrade has been a pain point, but also kind of in a good way. Like, they're making you really take each piece, which is what Storybook does. It's just showing one component and really pulling that out of the rest of the environment, which is what Storybook does. And that is the part that's painful. So it's not actually a problem with Storybook. Sorry, Mark. But it's just that, you have to just kind of wrap your head around how to do this. And I think that it is like a kind of a change in how we think about things, but it's also so helpful to be able to bring in the guys to teach us how to do this properly, because we still have to go through the journey and update all the code, but it's so much better to do that when you're really confident about exactly how it needs to be done. Then it's not this, I don't know what to do. So
I can really advise teams, especially, I mean, we have this is a really large application, right? And it takes a lot of time to convert stuff. I didn't even attempt to do the automatic schematic for conversion, right? Because I thought I tried it on a small app. It worked pretty well, but it left quite a lot of stuff behind, commented out and stuff. So I thought, okay, we did everything manually, but I can really recommend going standalone. I wouldn't want any other way. I mean, I had some doubts in the beginning about organization and I was completely married to modules. I loved them, really. But now I hate them. I mean, no. But seriously, standalone is so much nicer. So yeah. I have one little bone to pick though with Storybook, if I may. It's a really small thing.
As long as you be nice to them.
No, I'm always nice. I'm a hardcore Angular developer. Since Storybook 7, I have React as a peer dependency in my package.json. Can we solve that, please? Because it actually is causing issues with additional dependencies because it's now on the peer dependency level and no longer a deeper dependency. I think it's a known issue. I think I saw something on the Storybook issue tracker, but yeah, I can't get rid of it now. So I have an Angular project with React in there.
And
There's nothing wrong with React, don't get me wrong, but still.
the fun thing is that I have it the other way around. Not having it explicit actually oftentimes crashes my dependencies just by npm installing stuff, and then I have a Storybook React instance, and some other package also for some reason depends on it, and then I have two clashing React versions. And I don't know, Mark, if you have if you remember the reason. From my understanding, it was like wasn't it the idea to actually bundle it alongside Storybook? You notice?
I'm not sure because
it was an explicit. It was an
yeah.
explicit decision, though, as far as I can remember, to make it that way.
Yeah, that I'm not too sure about because I know it's like I've got React as like a dependency in my application because I have some custom React components that I used in MDX templates and Storybook. So I just had React as a dependency from that, and I did that like 2 years ago and just haven't changed it. But I'm not too sure about that. So, I'd have to search for that.
Yeah, this wants me to make like Bootstrap a fresh Angular instance with Storybook on top. And let's see what happens in the dependency tree. If React doesn't appear there, then it should not be the case, and it's a bug, I guess.
Yeah, I guess it happened from 6 to 7, right? Yeah, from 6 to 7, it suddenly appeared in when we did all the upgrades. It was suddenly in the peer dependencies, and we now have React errors sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess it's going to need React. I mean, React is, I guess, gonna need to be in the dependency somewhere probably because I mean, Storybook is using it internally. I mean, I guess maybe that could be bundled, but
it used to be a peer dependency of Storybook, and now it's a peer dependency on the project itself. It seems.
Maybe this would be because we went past the top of the hour and we can stay a bit longer, but this I think would be a good thing for you to create a little post in the Storybook channel, and then Mark would be able to come back to it.
Great.
Because that might be really good feedback for the team. We can't solve everything in one Friday, you guys.
I've got a huge roadmap item for Q4 now.
Standalone, man. But you can hire me.
really well. So if you can and trust the schematics with like having 300 changes in your project, just commit, close your eyes, commit, and push it to production on Friday.
Yeah. But
this is awesome. Okay, I'm going to turn off the recording soon. Any more questions? We can stay for the Friday social, obviously, as you guys know. Any more questions before we turn off the recording? No? Okay. You know the drill at Angular Nation. We have a tradition. Everybody please come off mute and help us thank our guests.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Great. It was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers. Use signals for state. Use RxJS for events. I think like that is actually the kind of academic dividing line between these two systems. RxJS is kind of functional programming. Signals are a branch of computer science called like self-adjusting computations. And the difference is exactly that. It's this component of time. Something happens as an event. It's a point in time. A signal is a value that transitions to other values. And so that's kind of a great rule of thumb is signals for state, RxJS for events. Now, the thing I will say is, having looked through lots of Angular application code, there are many, many cases where the existing usages of RxJS are for state. It is actually somewhat rare to be using RxJS specifically for events. So I think what you'll find as you start doing these migrations is you need less and less RxJS in your applications. That there are many of the cases can be handled just by flowing state directly. And so with zoneless, we painted a picture in the signals RFC that was, hey, there's this thing called signal components. And signal components are components where the template is updated exclusively through signals. And if you can get your application into that state, then you don't need Zone.js anymore. Because Angular is understanding where all of the change is coming from. We've kind of taken over the job of zones at a much more granular level. And one of the things we've realized as we've kind of iterated on this design is that's actually a really big ask for application developers, to move every single component to update only with signals. And it's not just your components, right? Every library you depend on has to also be doing the same thing. And so we've started looking at, is there an easier, more incremental path to zoneless, where it's not this holy grail at the end of a huge amount of work to migrate everything to signals, but something you can get to sooner rather than later? And I think the answer there is yes. So I think we'll probably have a couple different flavors of zoneless, depending on kind of what part of this migration path you're in at a given time.
Okay. So what do you mean by different flavors, like partially zoneless or?
My definition of zoneless is that you don't have to load Zone.js. So I don't think I don't know if partially zoneless fits into the picture too much.
We love you, Kai.
Oh, you have to, sorry. Yeah, cheers.
Bye-bye.
It's more to do with how the change detection actually works. One of the hallmarks of Zone.js is kind of doing this top-down iteration through the component tree, where the application component gets checked first, and then its children, and then its children. When you're all in signals, you don't need that hierarchy, because the signals are just telling you exactly what's changed, and it doesn't matter in what order you check them, because you know the set of things that needs to be checked at any given point. So it's more to do with, like, there will be different flavors of change detection. One for when you still are relying on this hierarchy, and one for once you finally kind of moved all onto signals, you no longer need the hierarchy, and that means the change detection code can probably be smaller. So it will probably be more of a code size and a bit of a runtime efficiency thing. Once you get all the way to signals, you get the performance benefit of not needing kind of such a structured approach to change detection.
Okay, but so the external dependencies would also have to be on that level where your code is set, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So this is that kind of change detection becomes like it's a good analogy. Like, it's just the final reward, right, for like beating the game, but you're having fun the whole time through. Things are getting better and better the whole time through.
Like being an Angular developer.
I hope so.
So just one quick thing. With
we've created a monster. This is what happens a lot. This happens a lot, Dominic, because once people realize, like, I can actually ask questions to a human instead of like Google, just like going on and searching on, Stack Overflow, then they come up with a lot more questions. But it's okay.
I'm going to start answering people's. I'm gonna start answering people's questions like that. Like, as a large AI language model, I can't.
No, if I ask too much, please just stop me. I don't want to take away space from anyone.
You're fine. They're good questions. A lot of people end up having the same questions. This is really why I put people in groups here, because over time, a lot of people come to me with questions and I'm seeing the same questions over and over again. So you might not realize it, but the things you're asking about, a lot of people also struggle with the same things. So you're fine. But Alex also is going to be busy, so he's going to tell us when he runs out of time.
Yeah,
he knows the drill.
My stop is on the hour, so I have a few more minutes.
So just last thing. For now, no last thing. You told us about the dependency graph feature.
Yep.
And you said something about the signal flow. Will there also be, or is there already a feature for like visualizing the signal flow?
We want to do signals in DevTools too. Yes.
Okay.
I don't know what state that's in, or if there's any implementation work on it, but that is a goal.
Cool.
That's on the roadmap.
Great. Awesome.
I probably, let me see if I can actually do something here.
While you're doing that, Alex, I wanted to mention to you,
Yeah.
do you remember last time you were here and I asked you a question about N1 plus N2 plus N3 and you said, go ask Minko? He's coming next week.
Oh, cool.
So you're always welcome if you want to pop in and crash our party. It's the same link. And if you want, if you're interested in that conversation, I know you have access to Minko. You don't need us. But I can always copy you on the meeting invite if you want. It's not at the same time though. It's 9 a.m. your time.
This is a super like.
Are you sharing your screen?
Yes. 1 second. Need to do something a bit differently here.
And I want, if it's okay, Craig and Michaela, I want you guys to stay after class for a minute because I wanted to chat with you guys if that's all right, if you have time.
Sure. I'm trying to share my screen, Bonnie, and not share secret stuff. So.
You want me to turn off the recording?
No.
Well, you know, I can easily like edit stuff out too.
Yeah, this should be fine.
You're gonna leak any V17 surprises? Can you give us a hint, Alex?
I mean, the commit is public, right? So just like,
So there's but there's a big surprise coming. Is the surprise public or the surprise is not public?
The surprise is not yet public.
Can you give? Are you don't? Because I was told that I am not allowed to give anyone hints. I can't
give hints either.
Yeah, that was the deal. Like you can say there's something exciting coming, but you can't even like and we can let people guess, but I'm not allowed to say if you're right.
So this is the injector tree visualization that's in the DevTools. So this is coming in V17. I think I stole this screenshot from our draft of the blog post. But you can see that there's the injector tree section tab in the DevTools, and it's kind of visualizing the hierarchy of the injector and showing you like what the providers are at each in each node along the way. So I haven't played with this too much, but I just wanted to grab the screenshot just to show that, you know, this is kind of what it looks like.
That's really helpful. Love it. Alex, I wish you could come every week and hang out with us.
Is anyone going to be at NG Poland next month? No?
I haven't been traveling much. But I'm not far from Poland. So if you have time to stop in Amsterdam, I will meet you.
That is always tempting.
I have a guest room, Alex. I have 2 cats and I have a guest room and I am not that far away from Schiphol. So FYI, keep it in mind.
I will keep that in mind. Yeah, I'd love to hang out.
Me too.
Yeah. So I think I'll probably stop here, but thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I love these kinds of things.
We love it even more than you do.